So today is the first Sunday of Advent. It's the beginning of the church's liturgical year. So today, in essence, is New Year. Happy New Year. It's a day when we can begin again. We can start over. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, Advent asks us one really important, decisive question. Where do you long for liberation? Where do you long for freedom? Where do you long for release from whatever is tyrannizing you? Where do you experience burden or captivity or imprisonment or enslavement? Where do you feel like you are in exile from God? Where are you longing for that connection to happen? How might you add your voice this Advent to that hymn, O come, Emmanuel? This Advent, we're going to spend some time with this hymn. We're going to sing portions of it every single week that we gather for worship in light of the themes, the Advent themes of hope, peace, joy, love, and light. The hymn harkens back to a very particular time in the history of the people of Israel, a time when they were in exile, longing to return home. It gives voice to that longing. It gives voice to the more general longing of the Jewish people for the Messiah to come. And it gives voice to our longing as Christians for the birth of Christ, for the coming again of Christ. This hope and longing we express when we say, come, O come, Emmanuel, which means God with us. The hymn is based on the O antiphons, the medieval liturgical texts that were recited and sung in the 7 days before Christmas, and the verses point to the coming Christ, and the chorus expresses the hope and joy that God's promises will be fulfilled. And that melody, so hauntingly beautiful. We don't know the composer. We believe it was based on a 15th century missal discovered in the library of Lisbon, Portugal. A melody we believe that was chanted during funeral processions as the body was carried from the funeral mass to the graveside. I think that's what's truly haunting about this hymn. It combines a melody with a minor key with this joy and hope for the future. I think it's beautiful that a melody that was sung to mark the end of someone's life has now been repurposed to mark the beginning of another year and another place of longing. As we prepare for the birth of Christ, and as we journey again with Christ into his adulthood, through his life and his teachings, as we walk with him through Holy Week during the Passion, as we remember how he was crucified, and then remember how he was risen to be among the disciples, empowering them, inspiring them, shaping them as the early Christian church, of which we are just an extension. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appears. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to us, O Israel. It gives expression to that Advent hope. And what I want to do today is I want to look at hope, and I want to distinguish it from optimism and positive thinking, both of which can be very important, but hope, Advent hope, is something different. And I want to lift up 2 points. The first, I think Advent hope, more than optimism and more than positive thinking, has room for patience with and reverence for suffering. Number one. And number two, I think Advent hope, more than optimism and the power of positive thinking, calls upon, trusts in, and surrenders to a power that's at work in our lives and all around us all the time. So let's take those one at a time. Advent hope has room for patience with and reverence for suffering. You hear this loud and clear in Paul's words. He writes, the creation waits with eager longing, its suffering in hope that we will be set free from its enslavement to decay. We know that the whole creation has been suffering, groaning together as it suffers the pains of labor. And we ourselves groan inwardly. We ourselves suffer as we hope for what we do not see and wait for it in patience. And this point is made even clearer when we remember that the word patience has its root in patior, which means to suffer. Paul refuses to gloss over the reality of suffering in human life. For human beings, but also for the planet, for our creatures, our brothers and sisters. But he says that we have to be willing to suffer, even as we face the suffering. We have to be patient in the midst of suffering, even as we tend to the suffering within our families and communities, within creation. For there is more to life than simply the relief of suffering. It's about working faithfully and creatively with suffering, as a mother does when she gives birth to new life. Paul calls us to resist those two temptations that we all feel when suffering visits our life or when we see it there in the world. And that temptation is to cling to suffering, to over-identify with it, and to reject it or to resist it, which brings upon its own suffering. Both of these temptations bring on more suffering, but the suffering that Paul is calling us to take on is the suffering of waiting patiently with hope. He understands that how we relate to suffering in the end determines whether suffering will break us down or will enable us to break through to a better, more faithful life. Paul is saying, let suffering do its work in your life and be willing to suffer patiently as you wait and hope. I think Advent hope only begins at the point when we can accept the painful truth that we can't alleviate all the suffering, that we can't fix the problem of suffering in our life or in anybody else's life, let alone the world and the planet, and we can't control the outcome. I think Advent hope begins with that hard truth, that hard reality in our lives. I think Advent hope begins to grow in us when we learn to welcome all that comes our way. Painful thoughts, painful emotions, painful people, painful circumstances, painful conditions, and practice letting go of that desire to control and fix everything all the time, and to learn to surrender into it, to welcome it, and to find a creative path to work with it, opening ourselves to the love and power of God in all circumstances. Now, welcoming suffering does not mean that we don't long for change or long for growth. We never let go of that. But what it does mean is that we're open in the midst of it. It doesn't mean we stop caring about global warming or artificial intelligence or the altering of the human genome. No, it doesn't mean that we stop caring about the grief in our lives or our moral failures or our physical or mental decline or our diagnosis. But it does mean that we resist the temptation to give up or to grasp for control and learn to trust God in the midst of it. One day, Edith Eva Egger visited two soldiers. Both had the same diagnosis, the same prognosis. They both lost their leg on the battlefield. And the first vet, Tom, lay in his bed, curled in the fetal position, railing against life and decrying his fate. While the second, Chuck, was out of his bed in a wheelchair, explaining that he felt as if he'd been given a new lease, a second chance at life. As he wheeled through the garden, he realized that he was closer to the flowers than he'd ever been, and that he could look into the eyes of children at their level. Two people, the same suffering, the same prognosis, but two radically different orientations in the midst of suffering. Advent hope has room for patience with and reverence for suffering. Number 2, Advent hope calls upon, trusts in, and surrenders to a power greater than us that is at work in and among us. I stumbled upon this story in the late 1900s of Clarence Wexler, who traveled west from Paterson, New Jersey, of all places, prospecting not for gold, but for coal, which at that time was as valuable as gold. He settled in mid-Appalachia where he began to dig, and within 10 years he founded a thriving coal mining town which was named after him. Wexler was a small town at first, but eventually grew. It became the hometown for many local miners. And over the years, there were some near disasters in that mining town, in the mine shafts. And it inspired that community to come up with an emergency action plan. And so they trained the mine workers on survival skills and escape techniques, and they trained the townsfolk on rescue operations. So the miners knew what it took to escape, and the families knew how to rescue the miners if they needed rescue. And that became particularly important one day in May when 13 fathers and brothers were stuck in mine shaft number 4. And so the miners put their plan into action. They rationed their supplies. They tried to stay calm. They sent the leaders ahead to assist and probe for possibilities. And it didn't take long before they realized that if they were to live, they would need to be rescued. So they imagined what was happening above them and outside, believing that the whole town would gather together and begin their rescue operation. And so they waited. They shared what little supplies they had. They calmed each other. And they listened. Tap, 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 tap. Help was on the way. They could hear it at every step. The promise of rescue was sounding. And in the end, thankfully, they were rescued. The people of Wexler practiced optimism through their escape training, through the techniques that they learned and the efforts they gave. If only they did the right things, they could get out of this mess. If we save our resources, probe the possibilities, use the right tools in the right way at the right time, and don't panic, we can get out of this disaster. Optimism says we can escape. But hope arose when, fresh out of optimism, the trapped miners heard the tap, 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 tap of the promise. They knew the unspoken promise that was built into their way of life, that the town would shut down for a rescue operation whenever it was needed. And they could picture that with their mind's eye, what was happening above them and outside. And when they heard the approach of the rescue team and could distinguish the voices, they knew that help was near. That's hope. Help is near. At times we can be filled with optimism and positive thinking. At other times we find optimism smoldering in the ashes of despair. But Advent does not depend upon optimism. Advent is rooted in a promise. The promise which becomes a way of life for God's people. Thomas Keating said of Advent hope, it is based on God alone, who is infinitely merciful and infinitely powerful all the time, including now. With whatever is going on in your life and our collective life. That's the promise that we find in Scripture. That's the promise that Moses encounters in the burning bush. That's the promise that God gives David when he says, build a home for me. That's the promise that God gives Mary when Mary consents to be a home for God. And that's the promise that has weaved its way through your life. Through those experiences that you've been through that seemed like dead ends and sure felt like it in the moment, but became the occasion for a new life that you could have never imagined. That promise has weaved itself through your life in those moments of profound suffering, which you would never want to visit again, but through which you discovered strange but beautiful gifts and the most invaluable life lessons. We see in retrospect what we miss so often in the moment. Theologian, paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin was one of the first Christians who was not threatened by the theory of evolution. In fact, he saw God work through evolution. There was no mental gymnastics that he needed to play. He came to understand that human beings have an evolutionary task, a unique evolutionary task entrusted to us by our Creator. And this life-transforming vision of human life, of planetary life, and God's presence in the midst of it was shaped in his life through incredible suffering. He was labeled an optimist, a positive thinker, but he carried stretchers in World War I in the trenches. And he, by speaking out, was labeled a heretic by the church he loved. Here's what he wrote in the Divine Milieu. He says, "You know it yourself, God, through having been born in the anguish of being human. On certain days, the world seems a terrifying thing, huge, blind, and brutal. It buffets us about, drags us along, and kills us with complete indifference. At any moment, the vast and horrible thing may break in through the cracks. We all know this. At any moment. The thing we try hard to forget, it's always there. Separated from us by a flimsy partition, whether it be fire or pestilence, storms or earthquakes, or the unleashing of dark moral forces that can callously sweep away in a moment what we have laboriously built up and beautified with all of our intelligence and all of our love. We know this to be true. We know this to be true. And yet Teilhard, the man who wrote those words, believed in Advent hope. He believed that we must not allow ourselves to be engulfed by fear or anger or grief. That is our task. Because if we do not allow ourselves to feel the weight of suffering, we will lose our moral nerve. And we will betray our evolutionary task entrusted to us and to our species as human beings. The unique role that God has given us to partner with God in caring for each other, in caring for the planet, caring for all the creatures of the planet. As Christians, as members of this community, we're called to live contemplatively and to act justly in the face of suffering. And here's what I think this means. It means that we wholeheartedly lament the suffering within our lives and around us and in our world. And we prayerfully keep our hearts open with active concern for the real suffering, doing what we can to tend to it at every point and at every turn while remaining open to what suffering has to teach us, and never losing sight of that Christ-inspired vision of our kinship with each other, with all the creatures, and in a creation that is groaning and waiting to be reborn. Every time we sing, O come, Emmanuel," we habituate that stance in the world. A melody that reminds us of all that is dying within us and around us. A melody that gives voice in the minor key to our suffering and the state of our world and the state of our lives, and whose words give voice to our hope and our joy of being delivered and liberated and freed and released and forgiven. And it focuses our heart on the one who is our hope and who comes to partner with us to bring hope to others and to the world. For when we turn to God, we see more of what God is up to in our lives and around us. We do see more signs, more glimpses of hope, and we better understand Emmanuel's heart. And we're more able to embody that heart in the world. So this Advent, we turn to God and we consider what God might be up to in our lives and in our community and in the world. And we ask Emmanuel to reveal his heart to us. This Advent, we are inviting you to participate in our mission campaign, inspired by Emmanuel's heart, to bring gifts to children whose parents can't afford it in our community, right here. People that we walk by every day. This Advent, we invite you to remember the traumatized and displaced people in the Holy Land. And we invite you to be part of an initiative that reminds them that not only does God see them and their humanity, so do we. And we invite you to help people who are shackled by medical debt find a way through that to the life that they long for. So now we're going to hear more about RIP Medical Debt, which is one of our 3 partners.
Over 100 million Americans, or 1 in 3, have struggled with the weight of medical debt, causing many to deplete their savings, turn to crowdfunding, declare bankruptcy, or worse, delay the medical care they need to stay alive. More than half of Americans say getting a bill they can't afford is as scary as a serious diagnosis itself. Our debt is killing us. But what if we could make that debt disappear? We're RIP Medical Debt, a nonprofit that has done just that, eliminating billions of dollars in debt for struggling Americans. We are working not only to shift the way we think about medical debt, but change the lives of people living in its shadow. So how do we abolish billions of dollars in debt without billions of dollars? By using the rules of the game, not to win, but to create a world where we take care of those who need it most. When you go to a doctor's office, hospital, or clinic, you might get a separate bill for every step of your care. If these bills aren't paid, they can be sold to a debt buyer for a fraction of what you owe. However, they will still attempt to collect the full amount owed from you. Some will add negative marks to your credit report, affecting your ability to buy a car or home, while others will even take legal action, resulting in wage garnishments and property liens. These actions used to leverage payment threaten the financial health of hardworking Americans who have this debt through no fault of their own. That's where we come in. RIP Medical Debt works with our partners to see through the chaos and find those debts that will be the most impactful when relieved. While we can't search for a particular individual's debt, we can filter them down to make sure we're serving the people who are least able to pay. With our donor support, we're able to buy millions of dollars of debt at drastically reduced pricing, which makes this disappearing act one of monumental proportions. But we don't stop there. We make sure any negative marks on credit scores for the debt we buy are removed. So not only can recipients forget their past, but they can begin to move forward. Our programs put no additional tax burden on the recipients and are compliant with HIPAA and the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And after all the behind-the-scenes work is done, every year we send out thousands of letters to homes all across the country, letting people know their past is in the past. Their health is not a burden, and their life is worth more than a bill. And together, we'll cure medical debt.